Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Mills. I'm an associate at Zien, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's FS Club webinar. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to thank our sponsors, without which our free webinar program would not be possible. I'm sure that many of you will have heard the unwelcome news this morning that 750,000 people have joined the ranks of the unemployed since March of this year. And that's the steepest rise in unemployment since 2009. And with the uncertainty of the continuing pandemic combined with the looming threat of a no-deal Brexit, it's certain that more people will suffer the indignity of unemployment or underemployment. Now, today we're going to be addressing this topic by asking what governments can do by looking at public official e-markets. Our guide to this territory is going to be Wingham Rowan, and some of you may well recognise Wingham as the pioneering journalist who fronted Britain's first and longest running TV series about the internet. Wingham's earliest experience of this, then nascent technology, prompted him, with the support of Demos, to explore how the internet could help to deliver public services. Books, articles and a TED Talk followed before the government funded Rowan's team in a first build of the technology which he was championing, and trials took place in 20 city authorities across the UK. So, as governments explore increasingly radical policy possibilities post-COVID, the issue of how they can create better markets, not only for local businesses, but for those citizens at the bottom of the economy, becomes ever more urgent. Rowan's going to guide us through what the future might hold in just a second. But before he does, I would urge you to use the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will pick up your questions during Rowan's talk, and I will be putting them to him at the end. Rowan, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon. Yeah, this is about the question of how governments rebuild their microeconomy after COVID. And specifically, it's about the markets problem. So over the last few years, new technologies have created really cool ways to buy labor, to hire people for very precise short periods of time. But these markets are often terribly inadequate or exploitative from the point of view of people who need work. And governments have always tackled problems like this. In the 1930s, which of course were very tough times, they ramped up labor exchanges to ensure that there was economic opportunity. And it's really interesting now to ask, with all the new market technologies that have emerged, with the radicalness that Simon alluded to around policy, what might they do? And particularly of interest to FS Club members, I suspect, is, and what might that do in terms of creating opportunities for finance? So I've spent 25 years in this space, the space being how governments create much better markets at the bottom of the economy. And it's never felt so pivotal. So this is a big, meaty subject. If you're up for a bit of multitasking, please do feel free to open another browser and have a look at modernmarketsforall.org. While we're going through this. We're just going to skim it in this presentation, but modernmarketsforall.org will take you through a lot more detail. And Michael Manelli suggested, start with a poll, see what the audience think. So our first poll, please, Morgan, asks the question, and don't worry, there's only 2 polls in all. Post-COVID, government's involvement in the economy will be dramatically increased, increased somewhat, unchanged, or will decrease. So we're just trying to get a temperature check on what the group think on this question, because it is going to be crucial in the way economies rebuild. And when Morgan is ready, we should be able to see the kind of group analysis on this subject. Okay, right, yeah. 70% dramatically increased, 20% increased somewhat, 10% unchanged. Nobody thinks it's going to decrease. So this is, apologies, I have lost my slides somewhere. That's it, I've got you back. Okay, so if we can go back to the slides. So there is this mood, and I don't think many people would disagree with the analysis of that poll we've just done. Everybody expects the governments to get more involved in the economy. And here's some background to what they will be facing as this increase in involvement really gets underway. For the low skilled, for the low paid, by which I'm counting about 50% of the population, there is decreasing chances they will get a traditional job with regular hours and progression prospects and proper benefits and so on. Increasingly, the low paid are deployed as needed, hour by hour. 41% of America's hourly workers didn't know next week's hours and pay in 2016. That figure will be much bigger now. About 35% of the population were reliant on at least some so-called gig work. Before the pandemic, it's expected to be 50% early next year. And this fragmentation is driven by new technologies, by declining power of unions. Corporate short-termism is often cited as a cause. There are issues around the shift from a manufacturing to a services economy, and it is having a dramatic effect on people at the bottom of the economy. Just because we've got limited time, I won't go into the human and economic tragedy that is unfolding, but suffice to say there are some very unsettled, angry people looking to politicians for answers. And what I want to focus on is the quote, connective tissue. So if you are finding yourself looking for a few hours of low skilled, low paid work because that's all you're equipped to do, what are your options? And people are connecting to this work through some combination of three channels. There are, of course, the gig work platforms. There's thousands of them. They've often got a lot of money. They make a lot of noise, but they're statistically not particularly relevant to us. Far more of this work is found through corporate employees now being deployed very precisely hour by hour in line with the needs of the supermarket, the warehouse, the hotel, the leisure center, the care home, the whatever, where they work. And that's either done by new sophisticated software scheduling tools or just by a manager with a clipboard in a smaller company. And there's huge amounts of this irregular employment going on in the shadow economy. It's so easy just to ask around local businesses and households, can I just come and look after your kids, cut your lawn, clean the tables in your cafe, just give me 20 quid at the end of the morning, we'll say no more about it. So, and that of course is very bad news from government's point of view. And so the shadow economy has always been with us. It does seem to be growing in developed economies. It's believed to be between 10 and 12% the size of GDP in the US at the moment, about 19% in Britain, according to World Bank figures. But it's often overlooked what the high-tech new labour markets are actually like for the workers. So there's huge data deficit here, which would be incredibly frustrating to financiers, of course, but we just don't know what's happening. We don't have the numbers. But every so often, journalists go in and do a deep dive, often focusing on Uber, because it is the kind of star of these new labour markets. It has achieved stratospheric valuations, which makes it a pathfinder for everyone else. We know that Uber has systematically cut worker pay, and they incidentally take about 30% of the workers' earnings as their cut. We know that they have misled workers to keep them in the market. They do occasionally get caught doing this, but frankly, the fines are petty cash when you have that sort of valuation. You might think, well, doesn't this all show in the data? They don't share the data. It's very secretive. And you might think, well, surely regulators catch them. Well, no, they had software specifically designed to fool regulators. And that is the world of a new labour market. And it's not exceptional. It's the business model. There are a whole generation of labour markets out there that are not markets at all. They are slick ordering systems for commoditized, cheapened labour. And most of them, we just don't know what they're doing. We don't know how workforce scheduling tools are being configured by the big companies that run them, for instance. So if I'm trying to sell my labor, I really want an open market. I want to define my offer. I want to show initiative. I want to sell my entire gamut of skills and enthusiasms and aspirations. Well, good luck with that. If you want an open market at the bottom of the economy, you've got the old ways, the flyers, the classified ads, standing on street corners, handing out your business card. There are internet era open markets at the bottom. I don't know how to put this in such hallowed surroundings as the FS Club, but the best known is Craigslist. Google part-time work London Craigslist to understand the kind of opportunities that float around in these open markets. Let's just say I had no idea toe sucking was such a big part of the part-time economy until I looked at Craigslist again a few days ago. So the tragedy about this is that with the new market technologies over the last few years, open markets can now be so powerful. So if I'm selling any commodity or service, I really want to sell in a service in an exchange that is as deep as possible, as broad as possible, that has all sorts of functionality. It gives me, shares all the data so I can identify the opportunities, very low overhead. And I want to know the market is neutral, transparent, accountable, that I can completely trust it. And we see markets with these characteristics emerging largely, and I'm painting a broad picture here, but please bear with me so we can keep to time. Largely it's happening in the global finance sector. As that moved from open outcry and phone-based trading to today's world, it largely built itself markets with those 5 factors. And that, we believe, is a key factor behind financialization, the way that resources are sucked into these very efficient, data-driven, low overhead, fully functioned markets. And we badly, badly need that kind of marketplace adapted for the needs of people at the bottom of the economy. And long story short, that won't happen unless governments get involved. There just isn't a business model for the private sector to do it. And I know that will sound counterintuitive. So again, please just bear with me. But one way to take you through on a very quick crash course on this world of how governments can create much better markets at the bottom of the economy is just to share my story. And Simon alluded to it. I was a TV journalist, television journalist, running a TV program about the internet. I got very interested in the social and economic inclusion possibilities of the internet, which was then nascent. I wrote a few books about it. Charles Handy, the futurologist, got involved and was very helpful. Out of that, Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, the British government, funded a first build of the technologies required for these very powerful markets at the bottom of the economy. And apologies, those are actually screen grabs from our American markets, but the British markets came first. We were opposed by Department of Work and Pensions because they believed that government should be involved in job creation only, not in the world of fragmented employment. That all changed when Lord Freud became the Minister for Welfare Reform. He went on front pages to say that our markets were now a key part of his exciting plan to overturn the entire UK welfare state with what became called the universal credit. You probably know that didn't go entirely according to plan. In fact, it was a bit of a disaster. We were shelved along with several other promising labour market innovations, incidentally. We got permission to take a copy of the technology, put it in a non-profit for open sourcing, and looked at other countries. And it became clear that America could really do something like this through its public employment agencies. And we were funded by 4 national philanthropies, did a lot of work with public employment agencies across the US, and we now have markets running over there, launched by public agencies in Los Angeles County. And the first thing that you learn when you go into this journey is there's nothing odd or surprising about governments creating new markets. So even in the US, every state funds its own version of a job board. So you're obviously aware of monster.com, indeed.com, and so on. Well, in the US, there is also CalJobs, Alabama Job Link, Hire Florida, Employ Texas, and these are publicly funded job boards with no agenda beyond maximizing economic growth, making sure everyone gets the opportunities they need, generating data. And other countries do exactly the same thing at national level. Those are the equivalents of public sector job boards from Australia, Canada, and the UK. And post-COVID, that principle will still be there, that government creates better markets, just as there's nothing political about it. It's just much more efficient to know that there is a sort of catch-all market for people who aren't particularly commercially attractive for the for-profit players. There is a universal system that anyone can use to find jobs or find candidates for interview. So how's that going to look in this new era of very fragmented employment? Well, traditionally, government employment agencies, and these are often very well funded. In the US, the public workforce system gets billions of dollars, federal dollars, a year, and will top it up with other sources of income. And their focus has always traditionally been on this model. Let's take a young father and assume that he's in a job that's going nowhere. He's a warehouse operative, working odd hours, scrabbling for extra hours when his main employer doesn't need him. And the way that government employment agencies will have approached him has always been, how do we get him a better skill that equips him for a more robust job? We train him as a medical coder or how to be an IT help desk operator, for instance. And what we've been saying to governments over the last few years is, well, why don't you think about all his range of possible skills? So maybe he's got a driving license, he learned gardening when he was at school, he's obviously good at childcare, perhaps he was trained how to work a switchboard in past What are we going to do to release? Hello?
Hi, Wingham. You froze there for a second. Could you go back about 5 seconds and repeat what you were saying?
Yep. Okay, can you hear me? So apologies.
Yes, we can hear you now.
So yeah. Okay, sorry. I need to go back. Okay, so I was making the point that governments have employment services focused on giving people who need better work. I am trying to go back on my slides. There we are. They've traditionally focused on the first of those circles, giving a young father the skill that will equip him for a better job. The last few years and persuade governments that focus on an entire range of employment, not just. But what's really interesting and where it gets exciting, well, what's not just about he might have a bar he can rent out, he might have a barbecue he's not using this weekend that he could rent out, he might have storage space in his shed that he could rent out, he might have a parking spot he's not using. How do we as government make sure he has the best possible markets in which to trade a 360-degree view of his economic potential? And that is when I think it gets really exciting. So the first thing to realize is, predictably, government doesn't want to fund what will be a very expensive, very sophisticated system of e-markets to create all this seamless opportunity, and nor should government do it. They have a terrible track record for these big, ambitious IT projects. But the key to this, as to how government might give this guy and tens of millions like him the markets he needs, is understanding that government has unique benefits it can bestow on any system of e-markets for the microeconomy. So government is a huge buyer of flexible labor. All that could go through the new markets. Government has all the databases on who's licensed to do what. That can be, they can all be allowed to interface into new markets and so on. So these are compelling benefits for commercial operators. They should not be given away lightly. There needs to be obligations to act as a public service that go with them. So the key obligation is whichever consortium wins the benefits is going to fund the new markets. They're going to charge a flat rate percentage markup. They're going to maintain a focus on small transactions around what people at the bottom of the economy can sell. And you could imagine where government issues this concession. It says we're going to give these benefits for a period of 10 years to a consortium that it will complete the obligations and fund the whole thing. And they might make it competitive. Whichever consortium will commit to the lowest percentage markup charge on each transaction gets the deal. And our modeling suggests that figure will be about 2% as opposed to 30%. And if all this sounds a bit familiar, you're thinking of Britain's 1994 National Lottery Act. So the Conservative government didn't fund the National Lottery, didn't design it, doesn't run it. They did exactly that. They gave they described what they saw as the boundaries of the lottery. They gave it certain benefits. They imposed certain obligations. They awarded the concession to the winning consortium. They got out of the way. As we know, Camelot was hugely profitable, and it got that way because it massively increased gambling at the bottom of the economy. Our focus here is massively increased meaningful economic activity at the bottom of the economy using the same mechanism. So this creates what we call POEMs, and POEMs is a very sophisticated system of thousands of market sectors, each based around something that people at the bottom of the economy or small businesses at the bottom of the economy could sell. Anyone who's legally qualified can sell in any sector, as many sectors as they like. So I might be doing a bit of security guarding, some cleaning. I might be hiring out my high-end kitchen accessories, doing a bit of car valeting. I might be training people how to use a computer through POEMs, and it's constantly giving me the data that shows me where the opportunities are, where my most profitable openings are. I might be hiring out gardening equipment while the businesses around me are hiring out their vans. I might be selling meals in my home to people, and all the time the data is coming back. I can trust the markets. They're very, very low charge. It's ubiquitous. It interfaces into all the government bodies that are so important to me at the bottom of the economy. And the whole thing just sort of rolls on. It's a public utility. I use it if I want. I use it a bit if I want. I don't use it at all. There's no constraint on my choices. And I am aware that people in FS Club will likely be thinking, oh, this sounds like something that should be left to the private sector. I can see that people need it, but why not let the private sector build it? And I would say, why hasn't the private sector built it? Billions are poured into creating new marketplaces at the bottom of the economy in the last decade or so. And the short answer is, capitalism has always needed facilities it can't itself provide. And only government can aggregate markets on these scale, and only government can create these sort of underlying unique benefits that allow one system to operate at very, very low overheads. And that we can see that in the rearview mirror. We can see that exact pattern in technologies like electricity, public water supply, roads, railways, canals, gas, broadcasting, air traffic control. And if you're still thinking, oh, I still don't like this, it just seems too big and controlling, unhealthy for markets. Well, your worst nightmares are already here, courtesy of the private sector. That black box on the top of the picture is a car boot tidy, expensively developed by a small company that then sold it on Amazon because that's where it has to go, because that's where the buyers are. And below it is the much cheaper direct competitor developed by Amazon, obviously drawing on the data generated by all the risks the first little company took. So your worst nightmares are here. We already have these horribly distorted, all-powerful markets abusing their power. Giving people the choice of having a regulated public utility, which potentially has enormous power, should even out that a little. So, impact for finance. Well, when I talked to Michael Manelli about this, I used the phrase, oh, it'll create a whole new asset class. And he said, oh, that's probably going a bit too far. So bear with me while I try and make that case and see what you think. But there's two opportunities for financiers in this. Let's assume that a first government does conclusively say, we are going to create the best possible markets for people at the money. So, and we're not going to fund them. We're going to create concession to make it happen. That creates a possibility for infrastructure investment. You, the audience, will know far better than I how financiers regularly enable bridges, ferries, tunnels, roads, and so on. It's the same here. And there's some modeling on the left that shows if you get it right and you create a lot of new economic activity, it could be highly profitable. And I don't think anyone can complain about that because the consortium will have taken all the risks. What's really interesting to me is how it could work when the markets deepen and there's a lot of usage, because these markets will generate granular data that just is inconceivable at the moment. So a key metric is utilization. So if I want to work for 30 hours this week and I only get 15 hours booked, I have a utilization rate of 50%. You can measure utilization in poems across sectors, types of work, geographies, characteristics of the workers, and you can obviously see pay rates and how they're changing over time. And you can use this data to create all sorts of interventions. So an obvious one might be if roofers are very highly utilized and highly paid in Doncaster, and van drivers in Wakefield are low utilization, low pay, it's very easy to say, I will pay to train 100 provenly reliable van drivers in Wakefield to be roofers in Doncaster, but I want a minimum 20% of their earnings uplift for the following year as my cut for investing in them. And here's how you do it. That's a screen for a company that is planning to invest a lot market purchase, and users get what we call a opportunity fee, so they can see these opportunities, they're offered these opportunities, they decide which ones to accept. Now, as financiers, you're not going to go around looking at the levels of demand for plumbers in algorithms that systematically hunt for these openings within your boundaries, and the markets would welcome that. They are there to help you. They want these people to be upskilled and resourced as they're needed. And the question I'm always get asked at this point is, well, so is this going to happen? And I would say if it's ever going to happen, it's going to happen now. We live in extraordinary times, and the way the mood was shifting, the sort of wind of change began to be felt, I'd suggest, September last year, when this was the front page on the FT. You'll know about some data that was rather alarming for advocates of capitalism that emerged in the early part of this year, from early part of last year, sorry, from the WEF. And you've probably, and then of where they want the economy to go post-COVID. They absolutely don't want to go back to the old ways of doing things, which is all pushing governments towards ideas that were once just regarded as completely fringe. And what's interesting about modern markets for all as a policy is it needn't cost anything, in the same way the National Lottery didn't cost anything, and it widens everyone's choices, because you're not going to close down any of the for-profit markets. They're still there. It's up to the public and businesses to decide which markets they want to use. So at this point, finally, to close with the poll, the will governments do this? And I'm sorry, I'm trying to change slide. There it is. So final brief poll to close. Should governments use their leverage to initiate better markets at the bottom of the economy? Yes, unreservedly. Yes, with caveats. No. I'd be really interested in this one. And I think we should have results about now. Okay, right. Well, that's terrific. We have a firm, yes. Incidentally, I would place myself in the mid category. I think there are risks to government doing this, but you can mitigate them in the right. So if we could go back to the last slide, please, Morgan. So I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't have an ask for FS Club, and it is this. There is a very interesting parallel about the role financiers played in the launch of carbon markets and cap and trade as a solution to the climate crisis. Financiers, as I understand it, paired early on with bona fide environmentalists to go to governments and say, we think you should be doing cap and trade carbon markets. And the financiers were obviously understand markets, were very involved in the design and the planning of those markets. And I'd like to suggest there's a similar opportunity here for any financiers or financial institutions that think, we'd like to get in on the ground floor of this. We seriously would like to see better markets in the bottom of the economy. We'd like to create this asset class, with respect to Michael, for investing in people at the bottom. And let's start seriously planning it, and let's start seriously talking to governments with the people who are at the sort of non-profit front end of this movement.
Thank you very much, Wingham. And interesting you should talk about carbon markets, because I was the head of sustainable development for the City of London back in 2000 when carbon markets started taking off, and I was involved in some of those early discussions, and it was very much the City of London acting as the shepherd and bringing together the private sector to lobby government to get the private markets set up. Now, we've got some interesting questions from our audience this morning, and there was a rather tongue-in-cheek question right at the beginning when you were showing your picture of the labour exchange, asking whether there was a separate door for ladies and girls. And I think there is a serious point to be made there. How do you actually ensure that there is equality in the power relationships between employees and employers? How do you make sure that racism and sexism and ageism and all the other isms aren't built into the system?
Yeah, so my view is firmly that all this has to be defined in the concession. Government has to make it clear that these markets have to be neutral. And as part of that, you can facilitate inspection tools. So the obvious one is anyone who believes a company is hiring young women over others, for instance, can demand some sort of review process where, let's say, a magistrate looks at the record within the system. Who has this company been buying? Who have they been skipping over who might be better qualified to get to those people? So, and if the photos of the people they're hiring are wall-to-wall white, and you know there are much better qualified people of colour out there, that will show. It's then up to the concession to determine, well, what happens when that is proven? Do those people, does the company lose access to the markets? Is it a civil offence? These are all legitimate issues that I believe you can't solve completely, but you can go a long way to solving them in thinking through the concession properly.
There was another really excellent point brought up, which was, are Uber and the other similar employers about nowadays, are they really just the equivalent of 19th century mill owners in terms of sharp practice on employment and exploitation? Because at the end of the day, those problems were solved centrally by regulation. And some of the worst excesses were brought under control with child labour, etc. So is there a case for central government intervention to actually properly regulate some of these organisations and markets?
welcome to the world of algorithmic labor exchanges. The regulators aren't keeping pace, to be honest. So first of all, let's be clear, Uber isn't some desperate, evil genius. It's not Uber's job to run a healthy labor market. It's Uber's job to pay back their investors, and they're doing reasonably well on that front. It's government's role to make sure there are healthy labor markets. So rest assured, pushing back on Uber, and my God, Uber and their cohort are putting up a fight. So in California, there was legislation that kicked in on 1st of January called AB5 that forced Uber to treat their drivers as employees with minimum wage and so on. Uber, first of all, refused to comply. It is still being sued to comply. It's tweaked its design somewhat to create some changes. It has launched a $110 million fund to overturn the legislation in a November ballot, and a few weeks ago, state of California sued them over wage theft. It's endless slogging battle to try and fight these for-profit labor markets, and yeah, maybe carry on doing it, I don't know, but government could so much more easily say, actually, we've got the heft to create an alternative. And then why not just let Uber go its own way? So if I want to sell my time in Uber, that's my choice. But if I want a regulated, transparent, accountable labor market, that's there for me. That's exactly the principle of these publicly funded job boards. It says,
but isn't the bottom line that a lot of these types of firms, their entire business model is built on tearing up the social contract that has existed since the 1940s?
Yep, totally. Yeah.
Right, I've got another.
And that's my point. Either you fight them, or it's a bit crazy. Why not just say, well, let's create an alternative, and then let's fight them, or let's create an alternative and make sure everyone's aware of it. And then if people still want to go to Uber, well, that's the free market choice. The problem is at the moment, if you just want extra hours of work, you don't have a choice. You are going to end up in some sort of Uber-like service unless you're going to go into the illegal shadow economy. And that's desperate. There is a vacuum currently where there should be a healthy, robust market for the time and resources of low-paid people. And that vacuum is being exploited, frankly, by a bunch of get-rich-quick merchants. And it's always been the case. It's a deep historical trend.
That's a very good point, and I suppose to underline this, any form of itinerant worker, you've only got to think back to the way dock labour was organised in the 1920s. Any form of itinerant labour is an incredibly parlous existence. I mean, you are literally living hand to mouth. You're really restricted in what property you can rent to live in, what money you can borrow. Wouldn't a more effective way of implementing your scheme be to bring it in alongside some sort of universal basic income, so that you've got a floor below which it's difficult to drop?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think government should be looking at a whole range of policies, of which this just happens to be one, and it might be the easy win because it doesn't cost anything and because it widens everyone's choices. So it's hard to resist it unless you're a huge fan of Uber or an investor in Uber. But I would make the point that if you have the right infrastructure, the right markets, and they enable all sorts of very precise intervention, you can do.
So you've dropped out there.
The problem that some people often identify, with the right infrastructure, with markets like the ones I'm talking about, you could run universal basic income type schemes with extraordinary precision. So one of the complaints sometimes leveled at UBI is that it's given to millionaires as much as it's given to people living in abject poverty, because it is universal. So you could use the right infrastructure to support people in very targeted ways. So the money goes to the neediest, and you've got the channel there, people who are trying to work but not getting any work, can get funding people who need training. There's all sorts of ways you could allocate funds in a slightly more targeted way.
Excellent. Right, well, I think that brings us more or less to the close of our discussions this morning. Thank you very much indeed to all of you who've attended, and thank you for the excellent questions you've put towards to Wingham. They really have moved the discussion along in a really fascinating way. I'd just like to close by once again thanking our sponsors, without which this series of seminars wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to say that both this seminar and all of our previous seminars are all available to download free of charge. Recordings are all available to download free of charge from longfinance.net. In fact, you'll find the majority of the content on longfinance.net is free to access. And I'd just like to put a plug in for a few of our forthcoming webinars. On the 14th of August, we've got the case for employee share ownership. On the 25th of August, we've got ethical banking, a case study of the Fair Banking Foundation. And on the 27th of August, we've got a focus on the Financial Centre of Toronto in our Financial Centres of the World series. Please do visit the website that's on the bottom of the page for further details. So Wingham, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really enjoyed it. And if anybody has got any direct questions for Wingham, please contact us and we will put you in touch. Thank you very much, everybody. Good morning.